Mud tastes like old copper and rot. The freezing rain didn't just chill Maeve. It chewed through her thin morning dress and bit into her collarbones like dull teeth. When Constance slammed the heavy oak door of the manor, the deadbolt's click sounded louder than the thunder. Maeve had nothing but a split lip, ruined shoes, and 3 miles of empty, flooded road ahead. Then came the heavy, rhythmic thud of a crested carriage. It wasn't a rescue. It was a roadblock. The foyer had smelled of beeswax and stale lavender. Now, out on the gravel drive, all Maeve could smell was the sharp metallic tang of the coming freeze and the wet wool of her own useless shawl. Constance hadn't yelled. That was the worst part. If her stepmother had screamed, if she had thrown a vase or raged about betrayal, Maeve could have braced herself against the heat of it. Instead, Constance had stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tight against her ribs, her breath pluming in the damp air. Her face was as pale and pinched as a bruised root. "The creditors arrive on Tuesday, Maeve," Constance had said, her voice entirely flat. "There are 3 beds left in this house. The girls need 2. I need 1. You are a drain on the flour, the coal, and my patience. Go to your mother's people in town." "My mother's people are dead," Maeve had replied. "Then I suppose they won't mind the intrusion?" The door shut. The lock turned. Maeve stood on the crushed gravel for a long time. She didn't weep. Weeping required energy, and her stomach was an empty, echoing cavern. She had eaten half a heel of stale bread since yesterday morning. Her body was already beginning the slow, systematic process of shutting down non-essential functions to keep her core warm. The rain started as a mist, clinging to her eyelashes, before thickening into heavy, agonizing drops of sleet. She turned away from the door. Her boots, inherited from her late father and stuffed with rags at the toes to make them fit, immediately sank into the saturated earth of the driveway. A cold, wet shock seeped through the cracked leather soles, soaking her stockings. She walked. There was no theatrical backward glance at the home of her childhood. The limestone walls of the estate were already fading into the miserable gray twilight. Maeve kept her head down, her chin tucked into her chest to protect her throat from the wind. Her hair, usually pinned up in a severe, practical knot, began to loosen. Wet strands plastered against her cheeks, heavy and clinging like seaweed. "Just walk," she told herself. "Left foot, right foot. Pull the heel up out of the muck." The turnpike was worse. Deep ruts carved by heavy wagons had filled with freezing water. The mud here was thick, adhesive, sucking at her oversized boots with every step. Her thighs burned. Her hands, shoved deep into the inadequate pockets of her dress, lost feeling entirely. First came the agonizing pins and needles, then the dull throbbing ache, and finally a terrifying heavy numbness. She tripped. Her toe caught the edge of a submerged stone, and she pitched forward. Maeve threw her hands out to break her fall. The icy water of a puddle slapped her in the face, invading her nose and mouth. The grit scraped her palms raw. She lay there on her hands and knees in the middle of the road, the rain hammering against her spine. "I am going to die out here." The thought wasn't panicked. It was a cynical clinical observation, a completely unoriginal death. Frozen in a ditch because a bankrupt widow didn't want to share a scuttle of coal. She tried to push herself up. Her arms trembled, betraying her. She was so incredibly tired. The mud was soft. It would be so easy to just lower her cheek back down to the wet earth, close her eyes, and let the cold finish its work. But then the ground began to vibrate. It started as a low, rhythmic thumping in the earth beneath her raw palms. Then came the unmistakable sound of heavy leather harnesses slapping against wet horseflesh, the jingling of brass bits, and the violent, churning crunch of wooden wheels chewing through the flooded gravel. Maeve didn't want to be saved. Not really. But an older, deeper animal instinct panicked at the thought of being crushed. She scrambled backward, slipping in the slurry, her ruined fingernails digging into the embankment. She dragged herself out of the main track just as the massive black bulk of a carriage surged out of the fog. 6 enormous bay horses, their coats slicked dark with rain and sweat, tore down the road. Steam poured from their nostrils in thick white clouds. They were moving too fast for the conditions. The driver, a hulking shape bundled in a heavy oilskin cape, saw her at the last possible second. He swore violently, hauling back on the reins. The horses shrieked, a terrifying high-pitched sound. The massive beasts reared, their iron-shod hooves striking the air. The carriage slewed sideways, the rear wheels locking and skidding through the mud, throwing up a massive wave of freezing, filthy water that washed entirely over Maeve's huddled form. The vehicle lurched to a violent halt. The carriage pitched, groaning on its heavy leather springs, mere feet from where Maeve crouched in the ditch. Silence descended, save for the heavy, panicked snorting of the horses and the relentless drumming of the rain on the lacquered roof. Maeve coughed, spitting grit and dirty water onto the road. She wiped her mouth with the back of a trembling, mud-caked hand. She was so cold she couldn't feel her own jaw. Up on the box, the driver was wrestling with the brake lever. "Ho there! Steady!" he bellowed at the team. He peered down into the gloom. "You bloody idiot!" he shouted at Maeve. "What are you doing in the middle of the turnpike in a gale?" Maeve opened her mouth to speak, but her teeth were chattering so violently she bit her own tongue. The sharp, coppery taste of blood flooded her mouth. She swallowed it down. Before the driver could yell again, the door of the carriage swung open. A heavy leather-bound boot stepped onto the folding iron step. Then another. A man descended. He didn't rush. He didn't leap out with a lantern and a cry of concern. He stepped down into the ankle-deep muck with a look of profound, exhausted irritation. He wore a dark wool greatcoat, left unbuttoned, revealing a perfectly tailored charcoal waistcoat and the subtle gleam of a silver watch chain. He didn't wear a hat. The rain immediately began to ruin his dark hair, plastering it against a sharp, unforgiving forehead. Alistair, the Duke of Penrith, looked down at her. He didn't see a tragic heroine. He saw a filthy, shivering lump of wet wool and mud. He let out a long, slow breath, a cloud of white vapor escaping his lips. "Is it dead?" Alistair asked the driver, not taking his eyes off Maeve. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that cut right through the sound of the storm. It held no warmth. "She's alive, Your Grace," the driver called back. "Crawled right in front of the team, she did." Alistair reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a pair of leather driving gloves. He methodically began to pull them on, adjusting the fingers. "Can you stand?" he asked her. Maeve glared at him. The sheer arrogance of the man, standing there pulling on dry leather gloves while she was freezing to death in a puddle, sparked a tiny, furious ember in her chest. It was enough heat to make her move. "I can," she rasped. Her voice sounded like two stones grinding together. She pushed herself up. Her legs wobbled, devoid of strength. She swayed, her vision swimming with black spots. She braced a hand against the muddy wheel of the carriage to keep from toppling over. Alistair watched her. He made no move to catch her. He simply assessed her, his pale, sharp eyes taking in the oversized boots, the threadbare morning dress, the split lip, and the absolute defiance radiating from her shivering frame. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Town," Maeve lied. She had no destination. "Town is 14 miles away," Alistair said flatly. "You will be dead from exposure in 2. Then I will die quietly and stop delaying your journey." Alistair blinked. The corner of his mouth twitched, just a fraction. It wasn't a smile. It was an acknowledgement of a direct hit. He looked at the mud dripping from her hem, then up at the dark, unforgiving sky, and finally back to the carriage interior. He seemed to wage a brief, entirely pragmatic war in his own head. "Get in," he said. "No." The word was out of her mouth before she could think. Alistair sighed, a harsh, impatient sound. "I am not offering you salvation, madam. I am preventing a corpse from littering the King's Highway on my property. Get in the carriage." He didn't wait to see if she would obey. He turned and climbed back inside, leaving the door hanging open to the storm. The interior of the carriage was a shock to the system. It smelled intensely of dry, oiled leather, sandalwood, and the faint, bitter tang of expensive cigar smoke. Beneath one of the crushed velvet seats, a brass foot warmer radiated actual physical heat. To Maeve's frozen skin, the air inside felt thick enough to chew. She hesitated on the iron step. Her clothes were saturated with freezing mud. The upholstery was a pristine, deep burgundy velvet. If you are going to bleed to death or freeze, kindly do it quickly. Alistair's voice came from the shadows of the forward-facing seat. You're letting the damp in. Maeve grit her teeth, gripped the brass handhold, and hauled herself up. She collapsed onto the rear-facing bench opposite him. She didn't sit back. She hunched forward on the edge of the cushion, trying desperately to keep her filthy skirts from touching the velvet. The door slammed shut behind her, plunging them into near darkness, illuminated only by the faint, flickering light of the carriage lamps outside, bleeding through the rain-streaked glass. The carriage lurched violently forward as the driver cracked the whip. Maeve was thrown back against the squabs. She gasped as the impact rattled her bruised ribs. Alistair sat perfectly still across from her. He had unbuttoned his greatcoat and was watching her with an unnerving, clinical detachment. "You are ruining the upholstery," he observed mildly. "I tried to stay in the ditch," Maeve shot back, her teeth chattering so hard the words fractured. She was shivering uncontrollably now. The sudden introduction of heat to her freezing body was almost agonizing. Her skin burned and pricked as sluggish blood began to force its way back into her extremities. Her nose was running. She dragged the back of her wrist across her face, not caring how it looked. She was too miserable for pride, yet too angry for humility. Alistair reached beside him. He picked up a heavy dark gray wool blanket, something tightly woven and incredibly expensive, and tossed it across the small gap between them. It landed on her lap with a heavy thud. "Wrap up," he commanded. "If you die of pneumonia in here, the paperwork will be endless." Maeve looked at the blanket. It was dry. It looked incredibly warm. She wanted to throw it back in his arrogant face, but her hands were already moving of their own accord, dragging the heavy wool up over her shoulders. She buried her face in the collar. It smelled faintly of horsehair and rain, but mostly of the man sitting across from her. She huddled beneath it, shaking violently. "Who threw you out?" Alistair asked. Maeve stiffened. I wasn't thrown out. I was out for a stroll." "In a gale, without a bonnet, wearing a man's boots that are 3 sizes too large." Alistair leaned his head back against the velvet, his eyes half closed. "You are a terrible liar. It is an unbecoming trait. I don't recall asking for your opinion on my character." "You didn't? But you are dripping swamp water onto my boots, so I feel entitled to some conversation." He crossed his legs, the leather of his boots creaking softly in the quiet cabin. "Was it a husband?" "I'm not married. A father, then." "Dead?" Alistair's eyes opened. He studied her in the dim light. Maeve hated the way he looked at her. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her the way a man inspects a broken wheel on a cart, trying to determine if it can be fixed or if it should be left by the roadside. "Stepmother," Maeve finally spat out. The word tasted foul in her mouth. "The estate is bankrupt. She needed my bed for herself. I was told to find my mother's people." "And are they in town?" "They're in the ground." Alistair went quiet. The carriage swayed heavily as it hit another rut, the springs groaning underneath them. The brass foot warmer clinked. "So you have nowhere to go," Alistair stated. It wasn't a question. Maeve pulled the blanket tighter around her throat. The heat of the cabin was finally penetrating the wet wool of her dress, but it made her feel sick and dizzy. "I will find a scullery that needs washing, or a tavern. I don't need your pity." "I assure you I have none to give," Alistair said smoothly. He reached into his coat and withdrew a silver flask. He unscrewed the cap and held it out to her. "Drink." Maeve stared at it. "What is it?" "Poison," he said dryly. to save me the trouble of listening to you chatter your teeth to dust. It's brandy. Drink it. It will stop the shivering." Maeve hesitated, then reached out. Her hand was shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Alistair's gloved hand moved instinctively, his fingers brushing against hers to steady the flask. Even through the leather, his grip was firm and shockingly warm. She yanked the flask away, brought it to her lips, and took a deep swallow. The liquor burned a fiery path down her throat, hitting her empty stomach like a lit match. She coughed violently, eyes watering, but a genuine radiating warmth immediately began to bloom in her chest. She handed the flask back. "Thank you," she muttered, hating the vulnerability the words required. Alistair took it, wiped the rim deliberately with his thumb, and took a sip himself. He capped it and slipped it back into his coat. "We are bound for London," Alistair said, his voice lowering, settling into the rhythm of the rolling wheels. "We will stop at an inn in 4 hours to rest the horses. You may stay in the carriage until then. After that, you are no longer my problem." "Agreed," Maeve said quickly. She closed her eyes, letting her head rest against the swaying velvet wall. She was safe for exactly 4 hours. She was in a carriage with a stranger whose name she didn't know, bleeding mud onto his carpets, entirely ruined in the eyes of society. She had never felt more relieved in her life. Across from her, Alistair watched the steady rise and fall of her chest as exhaustion finally dragged her into a bruised, fitful sleep. He looked down at the mud pooling around his polished boots, then back up to the sharp, defiant angle of her jaw, even in rest. He had expected a weeping girl. He had found a feral cat. He didn't know yet which was more dangerous to his peace of mind. The carriage wheel struck a submerged stone, tossing Maeve against the hard wooden frame beneath the velvet. She woke with a violent gasp, her hands flailing to catch a hold that wasn't there. Her neck cracked sharply. The heavy wool blanket slipped to the floor, pooling in the muddy water she had dragged in. For a disorienting, terrifying second, she didn't know where she was. The air was thick with the scent of wet wool and stale tobacco. "We have arrived," a voice said from the shadows. Alistair was already buttoning his greatcoat. He hadn't slept. His eyes, a pale, flat gray, in the meager light of the carriage lamp, were fixed on the window. Maeve tried to sit up straight, but her body rebelled. The temporary warmth of the cabin had only tricked her nerves. Now that she was awake, the pain rushed in to claim its territory. Her joints felt as though they had been filled with ground glass. The raw skin on her palms throbbed with a hot, angry pulse. When she moved her jaw, the split in her lip tore open again, offering that familiar sickening taste of copper. Outside, the rain had slowed to a heavy, miserable drizzle. The carriage had pulled into the muddy courtyard of a sprawling timber-framed inn. The sign swinging violently on its iron hinges read, "The Boar and Barrel." The air bleeding in through the cracks in the door smelled of wood smoke, roasting mutton, and the sharp ammonia of stable muck. Maeve's stomach cramped so hard she had to fold her arms across her ribs. The smell of the fat dripping into a fire somewhere inside that building was an absolute agony. The door was yanked open from the outside. A stable boy, drenched and shivering, dropped the iron step. Alistair descended first. He didn't offer his hand. He stood in the mud, tossing a copper coin to the boy, before turning his head slightly to look back into the dark carriage. "The arrangement was 4 hours," he said, his voice easily cutting through the noise of the wind and snorting horses. "This is Crossbones. The London road continues south. Good evening." He turned and walked toward the glowing windows of the tavern. Maeve sat there for 5 long heartbeats. Her pride screamed at her to stay in the carriage, to wait until he was inside, and then slip away into the dark yard to find a dry corner in the hayloft. But the smell of the mutton drifted into the cabin again. It was a primal, overriding command. She grabbed the heavy wool blanket from the floor. She didn't care that it belonged to him. She wrapped it around her wet shoulders, gripped the brass handle, and dragged herself out into the freezing drizzle. Her legs nearly gave out when her boots hit the slurry of the yard. She staggered, catching her balance against the muddy wheel. She focused on the heavy oak door of the inn. Left foot, right foot. When she pushed through the door, The noise and heat hit her like a physical blow. The tap room was crowded with merchants, mail coach guards, and local farmers taking shelter from the gale. The air was thick with pipe smoke and the sour reek of spilled ale. The roar of conversation died a sudden, awkward death as Maeve stood in the doorway. She knew what she looked like. Her hair was a tangled, wet rat's nest. Her face was streaked with mud and dried blood. She was wearing oversized men's boots and clutching a Duke's driving blanket around a ruined morning dress like a beggar's shawl. Across the room, standing at the polished wood of the bar, Alistair was speaking to the innkeeper. The innkeeper, a stout man with a greasy apron, looked past Alistair's shoulder, his eyes widening in disgust at the sight of Maeve dripping onto his floorboards. "Here now!" the innkeeper barked, pointing a thick finger. "No vagrants in the tap room. Out with you. Back to the stables if you've got coin for straw. Back to the road if you don't." Maeve stiffened. She gripped the blanket tighter, preparing to turn around. She would not be thrown out of 2 buildings in one night. She would leave on her own feet. "She is with me." Alistair didn't raise his voice, but the absolute bored authority in his tone made the innkeeper snap his mouth shut. Alistair turned slowly. He looked at Maeve, standing in her puddle of filthy rainwater, a muscle feathered in his jaw. It was the only sign of his irritation. He turned back to the innkeeper and placed 2 gold sovereigns on the scarred wood of the bar. It was an obscene amount of money for a roadside tavern. "A private room," Alistair ordered, his tone clipping the end of every word. "A wash basin with boiling water, and a plate of whatever that is rotating on the spit. Brought up immediately." He tapped a single leather-clad finger against the gold. "She is not to be spoken to, and she is not to be disturbed. Is that understood?" The innkeeper stared at the gold, swallowing hard. "Yes, Your Grace. Of course, Your Grace. Right away." Alistair didn't look at Maeve again as he walked past her toward the staircase. "Follow the maid," he said over his shoulder. "Do not bleed on the bedsheets." Maeve stood frozen. She hated him in that moment. She hated his money, his careless authority, and the fact that he was entirely right to treat her like a feral dog he had dragged in from the rain. But her stomach gave another violent, agonizing cramp, and she lowered her eyes, following the terrified-looking maid up the narrow, creaking stairs. The room was small, drafty, and smelled overwhelmingly of old lavender and beeswax, a cruel echo of the foyer she had been expelled from hours ago. Maeve stood in the center of the braided rag rug until the maid scurried out, shutting the door behind her. Only then did Maeve let the heavy wool blanket slide from her shoulders. It hit the floorboards with a wet, heavy thud. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely manage the tiny buttons at the collar of her morning dress. The wet fabric clung to her skin like a cold second skin. She peeled it off, shivering violently as the draft from the poorly sealed window hit her bare arms. She stood in her damp chemise, her breath hitching in her chest. There was a heavy porcelain pitcher and basin on the wobbly washstand. Steam curled lazily from the lip of the pitcher. Beside it lay a sliver of harsh lye soap and a coarse linen towel. Maeve poured the hot water. The sound of it splashing against the porcelain was deafening in the quiet room. She plunged her hands in. The heat hit her half-frozen fingers like a hammer. She bit back a cry, dragging her hands out. The skin was bright, angry red, the cuts on her palms weeping. She forced herself to wait, breathing heavily through her nose before dipping the rag into the water and rubbing it against the lye soap. She washed methodically, brutally. She scrubbed the mud from her face, flinching when the rough cloth dragged over her split lip. She scrubbed her neck, her arms, her chest, trying to erase the physical evidence of the ditch. The water in the basin quickly turned a thick, opaque brown. She was just pulling the heavy wet mass of her hair over her shoulder to wring it out when a sharp knock sounded at the door. Maeve froze. "Who is it?" she croaked. Her throat felt raw, lined with sandpaper. "Open the door!" It was Alistair. Maeve looked down at herself. She was in a thin, damp chemise that clung to her ribs. "I am not dressed." "I have seen a woman's collarbone before. Open the door before I have the innkeeper take it off the hinges." I have no patience for modesty tonight. Maeve gritted her teeth. She grabbed the coarse towel and threw it over her shoulders, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She walked to the door and unlocked it, pulling it open just enough to see him. Alistair stood in the dim hallway. He had shed his greatcoat. His cravat was slightly loosened, making him look marginally less like a marble statue and more like a tired, irritable man. In his hand he held a dark green glass bottle and a folded pile of coarse brown linen. He didn't try to push his way in. He simply held the items out. "Willow bark tincture," he said flatly. "Drink half of it. It tastes like rotting wood, but it will bring the fever down. And clothes. I bought them off the scullery maid. They will be entirely too large, but they are dry." Maeve stared at the bottle, then at the clothes. She didn't reach for them. "Why are you doing this?" Alistair sighed, leaning his shoulder against the doorframe. He looked at her closely. He took in the damp, tangled hair, the hollow shadows under her eyes, and the aggressive, defensive posture of her crossed arms. "I am not doing it out of a profound sense of Christian charity, if that is what concerns you," he replied, his tone laced with heavy cynicism. "You are running a fever. Your teeth were chattering so loudly on the stairs I could hear them from the tap room. If you die in this inn tonight, the magistrate will delay my departure tomorrow to ask tedious questions." "I am not going to die," Maeve snapped. "You are shaking right now." "I am cold. You are sick. Take the bottle." Maeve snatched the items from his hands. The glass of the bottle was cold. The linen was rough but wonderfully dry. "And the food?" she asked, her chin lifting defiantly. "Was that also to prevent a magistrate's inquiry?" "The food was to stop the sound of your stomach growling, which was irritating me." Alistair pushed away from the doorframe. "Eat. Drink the tincture. Be gone before I wake at dawn. This concludes our transaction." He turned to walk away. "Wait," Maeve said. The word tasted like ash, but she forced it out. He stopped, looking back over his shoulder. His expression was guarded, anticipating a plea for money or a tearful breakdown. "Thank you," she said. It wasn't a soft, grateful whisper. It was a stiff, begrudging acknowledgement of a debt. Alistair stared at her for a moment. A tiny, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of his mouth. "You are very bad at gratitude. It suits you." He walked away down the hall. Maeve shut the door and turned the lock. She set the clothes and the bottle on the bed. A moment later, the maid arrived with a heavy tray. When Maeve was finally alone, wearing the scratchy, oversized scullery dress, she sat on the edge of the mattress. She pulled the plate of mutton onto her lap. It was greasy, charred on the edges, and swimming in salty gravy. Beside it sat a heel of dark bread. She didn't use the fork. She tore the bread apart with her hands, dragging it through the grease, and shoved it into her mouth. She ate with a frantic, desperate hunger, closing her eyes as the heavy, rich food hit her stomach. She chewed the meat until her jaw ached, swallowing it down in painful lumps. She ate like a feral animal, stripped of all the manners Constance had beaten into her over the last 10 years. And as she scraped the last smear of fat from the plate with her bare finger, the fever finally broke through. The heat washed over her, making her skin prickle with sweat. Her head throbbed in time with her heartbeat. She unplugged the green glass bottle with her teeth, spat the cork onto the floor, and drank half the bitter, foul-tasting liquid in one go. She collapsed back onto the cheap mattress, pulling the thin quilt up to her chin. The room spun slightly in the dark. She was warm. She was full. But as she drifted into a heavy narcotic sleep, only one thought remained perfectly clear in her mind. "He is leaving at dawn, and I have nowhere to go." The smell of brewing chicory and roasting oats dragged Maeve from sleep. She opened her eyes to a bruised gray morning light filtering through the dirty window pane. Her body felt like it had been beaten with a mallet. Every muscle screamed in protest as she pushed herself upright. Her mouth was dry, coated in the vile, lingering taste of the willow bark tincture. But her forehead was cool. The fever had burned itself out. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed. The scullery maid's dress hung off her shoulders like a sack. It was rough spun, dyed an ugly faded brown, but it was dry. She dragged a comb through the worst of her tangled hair, tying it back with a scrap of ribbon she found in the pocket of her ruined morning dress. She looked at her father's boots, still sitting in a muddy puddle by the door. She shoved her bare feet into them. They were stiff and cold. Maeve walked to the window and looked down into the inn's courtyard. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky the color of a bruised plum. In the yard below, the Duke's massive black carriage was being hitched. The 6 bay horses stamped their iron-shod hooves against the cobblestones, eager to move. Alistair was standing by the boot of the carriage, holding a pocket watch. He wore a fresh cravat, and his greatcoat was brushed clean. He looked entirely untouched by the misery of the previous night. He was speaking to his driver, pointing a leather-gloved finger toward the southern road. Maeve's heart kicked against her ribs. She had nothing. No money, no connections, no reputation. If she stayed at this inn, the innkeeper would have her washing pots by noon to pay for the bed, and she would spend the rest of her life scrubbing grease from other people's plates in a roadside tavern. Constance's voice echoed in her head, flat and cruel. "You are a drain on the flour, the coal, and my patience." Maeve turned away from the window. She marched out of the room, down the narrow stairs, and straight through the tap room. She ignored the stares of the early morning patrons. She pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped out into the freezing morning air. The yard was loud with the sounds of departure. Maeve walked straight across the mud, aiming directly for Alistair. The driver saw her first and frowned, moving to block her path. "Now see here, miss." "Stand aside," Alistair ordered. He didn't look up from his pocket watch. He snapped the silver lid shut and slid it into his waistcoat. He finally looked at her. He took in the coarse brown dress, the severe unpinned hair, and the dark circles under her eyes. He looked neither surprised nor pleased to see her. "I explicitly recall saying our transaction was concluded," Alistair said. "If you are here to ask for coin, the answer is no. I have already funded your survival for the week." "I don't want your coin," Maeve said. Her voice was steady, despite the heavy hammering in her chest. She stood tall, refusing to let her shoulders curl inward against the cold. "I want a seat." Alistair raised an eyebrow. "A seat." "To London." Alistair let out a short, harsh laugh. It held absolutely no humor. "You must be concussed, or the fever has addled your wits. I'm not operating a public stagecoach." "I know you aren't. I'm offering a trade." Alistair crossed his arms over his chest. He looked at her as if she were a puzzle he was rapidly losing interest in. "A trade. You have a dress made of potato sacking, boots fit for a giant, and a split lip. What precisely could you possibly offer the Duke of Penrith?" "Discretion," Maeve said immediately. Alistair's eyes narrowed. The boredom vanished from his posture. "Explain. You're traveling to London in the middle of a gale. You're driving your team into the ground to get there quickly. You don't have footmen with you, only a single driver. You are carrying no crest on the carriage doors." Maeve pointed a bruised finger at the plain black lacquer. "You are traveling incognito, and you are in a hurry." Alistair stared at her. The silence stretched between them, heavy and dangerous. The driver took a subtle step back, sensing the sudden shift in the air. "If I wanted a traveling companion, I would have brought one of my own class," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal murmur. "Someone of your own class would ask questions," Maeve countered, stepping closer. The smell of sandalwood and leather radiated off his coat. "They would want to know why we are rushing. They would require stops for tea. They would gossip when they are returned. I do not care why you are going to London. I do not care who you are hiding from, or what you are rushing toward. I just need to get there. And in exchange for this remarkable lack of curiosity, I am useful," Maeve said, her voice turning fiercely practical. "I managed an entire estate's ledgers for 5 years before my stepmother drove it into bankruptcy. I can read maps. I can write correspondence in 3 languages without asking what the words mean. I can sit in the corner of that carriage, entirely silent, and I will not require a single stop until we reach the city limits." Alistair studied her face. He was looking for the lie, for the desperate, pathetic plea. He found neither. He saw only a feral, calculated survival instinct staring back at him. "You are asking to be an unpaid secretary in exchange for transport," Alistair summarized. "I'm negotiating my fare," Maeve corrected. Alistair looked away from her, staring down the long, muddy stretch of the southern road. The wind whipped the tails of his greatcoat. He was a man who hated loose ends, and this woman was a massive, fraying thread. But he was also a man who appreciated ruthless pragmatism. He turned back to her. His gray eyes were hard, stripping away any pretense of politeness. "If you complain about the cold, I will leave you on the side of the road," Alistair said. "If you ask me a single personal question, I will leave you on the side of the road. If you bleed, vomit, or weep on my upholstery, I will throw you out while the carriage is moving. Do we have an understanding?" Maeve didn't flinch. She felt a vicious, triumphant thrill spike through her blood. "Perfectly," she said. Alistair stared at her for a second longer, a faint trace of genuine intrigue finally breaking through his cynical facade. He turned on his heel. "Open the door, John," Alistair said to the driver. He climbed up the iron step and into the dark interior. "And tell the girl to wipe her boots before she gets in." The journey to London was an exercise in physical endurance and aggressive silence. For the first 6 hours, neither of them spoke. The carriage rocked and plunged over the ruined roads, the heavy iron springs shrieking in protest. Maeve sat rigidly on the rear-facing bench. She kept her oversized boots tucked firmly beneath her rough wool skirts, terrified of tracking any more dried mud onto the burgundy velvet. She stared fixedly out the rain-streaked window, watching the bleak, sodden countryside blur past. Her back ached with a dull, rhythmic throb. The scullery dress chafed her collarbones, the coarse linen rubbing her skin raw with every jolt of the cabin. But she didn't shift. She didn't complain. She breathed through her nose, drawing in the scent of Alistair's dry sandalwood and the lingering bite of his morning cigar, focusing on the sheer, mechanical act of survival. Across the narrow space, Alistair worked. He had pulled a thick leather folio from a compartment beneath his seat. For hours, he scratched notes onto thick parchment with a silver travel pen, his brow furrowed in a permanent line of deep irritation. Occasionally, he would curse softly under his breath, crossing out a line of text with a vicious slash of dark ink. The carriage hit a particularly deep crater. The cabin pitched violently sideways. Alistair's pen slipped, tearing a jagged gouge across the paper and sending a heavy drop of black ink splattering onto his pristine charcoal trousers. He stopped moving. He stared at the stain for a long, terrible moment. The air in the cabin grew instantly thin. He carefully capped the pen, set it on the velvet cushion beside him, and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He let out a breath that sounded like a file against iron. "French," he said. His voice was a harsh, gravelly rasp. Maeve turned her head away from the window. "Pardon?" Alistair dropped his hands. He picked up a crumpled, water-stained letter from the pile beside him and shoved it across the gap between them. "You said you read 3 languages. Tell me you read French." Maeve looked at the paper suspended in his gloved hand. She didn't take it immediately. "I do." "Then read it." "My shipping agent in Calais writes like a drunken apothecary, and if I misinterpret this customs tariff, I stand to lose 4 warehouses of untaxed silk to the crown by midnight tomorrow." Maeve finally reached out. Her raw red fingers brushed against the thick leather of his glove. She took the letter. The handwriting was, indeed, atrocious. The ink was smeared, the script tight and heavily slanted. Maeve leaned closer to the dim light of the glass pane, her eyes scanning the jagged loops. She didn't try to translate it word for word. She looked for the structure, the legal phrasing her father had taught her when their own estate was failing and they were desperate for imported credit. The silence stretched. Alistair watched her. He watched the way her brow pinched, the way her lips moved soundlessly around the unfamiliar syllables. He noticed, with a detached, clinical observation, that the swelling in her split lip had gone down, leaving a dark, bruised line against her pale skin. He isn't writing about a tariff, Maeve said softly. Alistair sat forward, the leather of his boots creaking. Excuse me? It's not a tariff, she repeated, looking up to meet his hard gray eyes. It's an impound notice. The harbour master in Calais hasn't taxed your silk, Your Grace. He has seized it. They claim the manifest was forged. Your agent is asking for an immediate bribe of 400 francs to release the holds before the magistrate inspects them on Tuesday. Alistair went completely still. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking as carved and unyielding as granite. Read it again, he commanded softly. I don't need to. Maeve handed the letter back. The word is seizure, not taxi, and he references a specific article of maritime law regarding counterfeit seals. Alistair snatched the letter. He stared at it, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle twitched violently beneath his cheekbone. He didn't yell. He didn't throw the folio. The absolute freezing calm that settled over him was far more terrifying than a tantrum. Forged manifest, he murmured, his voice deadened. My brother, the stupid, grasping, arrogant little worm. He looked up at Maeve. He didn't look at her like a stray dog anymore. He looked at her like a tool he had just discovered was incredibly sharp. There's a stack of ledgers in the leather case beneath your feet, Alistair said. His tone entirely changed. It was clipped, professional, and entirely devoid of mockery. Pull them out. I need to know exactly how much liquid capital is tied up in the Calais warehouse, and I need to know it before we hit the London cobblestones. Maeve didn't hesitate. She bent down, ignoring the sharp protest of her bruised ribs, and dragged the heavy leather case onto her lap. The brass latches clicked open, revealing a thick stack of bound account books. They smelled of dust and old wax. Which year? She asked. The current one. Look for the holding company listed under the name Vanguard. Maeve opened the top ledger. The columns of numbers were tight, orderly rows of ink. For the first time in 48 hours, she felt the frantic, panicked drumming of her heart begin to slow. She understood numbers. Numbers did not lie. They did not throw you out into the freezing rain, and they did not care if you were wearing a scullery maid's dress. She ran her finger down the column. For the next 4 hours, the carriage ceased to be a prison. It became an office. Maeve calculated the sums in her head, calling out figures over the rattle of the wheels. Alistair cross-referenced them against his own notes, his pen scratching furiously. They didn't speak of the cold, or her lack of a bonnet, or the absolute ruin of her reputation. They spoke only of interest rates, shipping tonnage, and the aggressive liquidation of assets. When the carriage finally hit the paved roads of the city limits, throwing a new, harsher vibration up through the floorboards, Maeve snapped the final ledger shut. 12,000 pounds, she said, her voice hoarse from speaking over the noise of the road. If you cannot produce the bribe by tomorrow, the Crown seizes 12,000 pounds of silk. Alistair leaned back against the velvet squabs. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his eyes stark in the gloom of the cabin. But he looked at her with a steady, unbreakable gaze. Adequately done, he said. It was the highest praise he was capable of, and Maeve knew it. She rested her hands on the leather cover of the ledger, feeling the first faint stirrings of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Purpose. London did not welcome them. It swallowed them. The carriage rattled down streets choked with a thick, sulphurous fog that smelled of burning coal and raw sewage. The noise was a physical weight. The shouts of costermongers, the grinding of iron wheels against cobblestones, the distant, mournful blasts of river horns from the Thames. Maeve huddled into the corner of her seat, the sudden, overwhelming scale of the city making her stomach twist. She had never been to London. She knew no one here. The absolute reality of her situation came crashing back down, suffocating the brief confidence she had found in the ledgers. The carriage abruptly pulled out of the chaotic traffic and jolted to a halt. Maeve looked out the window. They were not parked before a grand sweeping estate in Mayfair. They were in a narrow-shadowed alleyway lined with tall, soot-stained brick buildings. The brass plaque on the door next to the carriage read, T.H. Corcoran and Sons, Maritime Law and Conveyancing. "Stay here," Alistair ordered, already unlatching the door. He didn't wait for the driver. He pushed the door open and stepped down onto the slick cobblestones, clutching the leather folio under his arm. He strode toward the door, pushed it open, and vanished inside. Maeve sat in the carriage. The silence left in his wake was deafening. The driver, John, remained up on the box, the horses blowing heavy streams of steam into the damp air. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The cold began to seep back into the cabin, creeping through the floorboards and settling into Maeve's damp boots. She wrapped her arms around her chest, staring at the closed door of the solicitor's office. After that, "You are no longer my problem." The words from the previous night echoed in her mind. He was in London. She had fulfilled her end of the bargain. She had kept quiet. She had found the error in the manifest, and she had survived the journey. The transaction was over. She was supposed to open the carriage door, step out into the freezing fog, and disappear into the city. She placed her hand on the brass handle of the door. The metal was freezing. Suddenly, the door to the solicitor's office flew open. Alistair stood on the threshold. His greatcoat was thrown back, his posture rigid with a barely contained explosive fury. A small, balding man in a dark suit was wringing his hands behind him in the doorway. "I do not care if the Bank of England is closed, Corcoran." Alistair's voice echoed sharply down the narrow alley, devoid of his usual icy control. "I need a draft for 400 francs drawn on a Parisian bank, and I need it dispatched by courier to Dover within the hour, or I will see you disbarred and working as a mudlark on the river." "Your Grace, please, I beg you to understand," the solicitor stammered, sweating profusely despite the cold. "The transfer protocols. The Vanguard account requires dual signatories. Your brother's signature is mandated for any draft over £100. "My brother is the one who forged the damn manifest," Alistair roared, taking a threatening step back toward the small man. "He is currently halfway to Scotland, hiding from my wrath. I cannot produce his signature." "Then my hands are tied, Your Grace. The bank will not honor the draft. The silk will be seized." Alistair stopped. He looked at the brick wall opposite him, his chest heaving. The absolute crushing weight of bureaucratic defeat settled over his shoulders. He had beaten the storm, he had beaten the clock, but he could not beat the ink on a bank mandate. In the carriage, Maeve let go of the brass handle. She didn't think. She acted on pure feral instinct. She pushed the carriage door open, grabbed her coarse skirts, and half-stepped, half-jumped down onto the wet cobblestones. Her boots slapped against the wet brick as she marched toward the doorway. Alistair turned at the sound. He looked at her, his eyes blazing with a mixture of shock and profound irritation. "Get back in the carriage. This does not concern you." "Your Vanguard ledgers are entirely separate from the estate entailment, correct?" Maeve demanded, walking straight past him and stepping into the dimly lit, paper-stuffed office. The solicitor blinked at her. He took in her muddy boots, her ruined hair, and the coarse, faded brown wool of her dress. "Who in God's name is this vagrant?" "Answer the question," Maeve snapped, turning her bruised, fierce face on the solicitor. "The Vanguard Holding Company is an unentailed asset, yes?" "Well, yes. Strictly speaking, it operates outside the primary ducal trust, but—" "Then you don't need a dual signature for a Parisian draft," Maeve cut him off, stepping up to his heavy oak desk and spinning the thick bank mandate around to face her. "You are citing the legal precedent of the 1792 Banking Act, which governs inherited familial trusts. Vanguard is listed in the ledgers as a private commercial enterprise." The solicitor gaped at her. He looked at Alistair. "Your Grace, I must protest." "Quiet," Alistair said softly. He stepped into the office, his eyes fixed entirely on Maeve. "Continue." Maeve grabbed a pen from the inkstand. Her hand was shaking slightly, but her voice was like cracked glass. "Under the Commercial Enterprise Act, a primary shareholder, which the Duke is, holding 80% of Vanguard's capital, can authorize an emergency letter of credit against future collateral without a secondary signature, provided the secondary shareholder is legally unavailable." She tapped the pen violently against the parchment. His brother has fled the jurisdiction. He is legally unavailable. Write the letter of credit against the Duke's private London townhouse, not the Vanguard account. The Parisian bank will accept a Duke's private property as collateral faster than a shipping company's liquid cash anyway. The office was dead silent. The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner and the heavy, ragged sound of Maeve's own breathing. The solicitor looked down at the mandate, then up at Maeve, his face pale. That is a highly unorthodox interpretation of the statute. It is aggressive. Is it legal? Alistair asked. His voice was a low, vibrating hum in the small room. The solicitor swallowed hard. Technically, yes. Then draw up the letter of credit, Alistair commanded. He walked slowly toward the desk, never taking his eyes off Maeve. And have the courier mounted in 10 minutes. The solicitor scrambled to his chair, frantically dipping a new pen into the inkwell. Maeve stepped back from the desk. The sudden surge of adrenaline began to recede, leaving her hollow and violently trembling. She realized with a sudden, humiliating clarity that she was standing in a London solicitor's office wearing a scullery maid's dress, barking orders. She lowered her head, the heavy fall of her tangled hair hiding her face. She turned around and walked out of the office, stepping back into the freezing, damp fog of the alleyway. She didn't get back into the carriage. She stood by the rear wheel, leaning her shoulder against the damp, lacquered wood, and closed her eyes. She had paid her debt. She had proven her worth. She was entirely, utterly empty. 10 minutes later, a young clerk burst from the office, sprinting down the alleyway with a sealed leather pouch clutched to his chest. Alistair walked out a moment later. He didn't rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who had just narrowly avoided stepping on a landmine. He stopped on the cobblestones and looked at Maeve, who was shivering violently against the carriage wheel. "The courier has departed," Alistair said. "Good," Maeve rasped, not opening her eyes. "We are going to my residence." Maeve opened her eyes then. She looked at him, her jaw tight. "Our agreement was transport to London. We are in London. This is where I leave." Alistair looked at her. He looked at the mud caked into the hem of her ridiculous dress, the dark bruises under her eyes, and the sheer, unbroken defiance radiating from every line of her exhausted body. "Don't be an idiot," he said flatly. He didn't wait for her to argue. He stepped forward, caught her by the elbow, his grip firm but entirely impersonal, and practically hauled her away from the wheel and toward the carriage door. "Get in," he ordered. Maeve was too tired to fight the physical strength of his grip. She stumbled up the iron step and collapsed back onto the velvet bench. Alistair climbed in after her, slamming the door shut. He knocked twice on the roof, and the carriage lurched into motion. The ride was short. They pulled into a private, gated courtyard behind an elegant, imposing townhouse in Mayfair. The contrast between the filthy alleyway and the pristine, gas-lit courtyard was jarring. Alistair escorted her through the servants' entrance, ignoring the shocked gasps of his own housekeeper and a passing footman. He led her up a set of narrow back stairs and directly into a massive wood-paneled study. A fire was roaring in a massive marble hearth. The room smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and expensive brandy. It was the warmest, safest place Maeve had ever been in her life. Alistair walked to a side table, unstoppered a crystal decanter, and poured 2 heavy glasses of amber liquid. He walked back to her and shoved one into her hand. "Sit down before you fall down," he instructed, gesturing to a heavy leather armchair near the fire. Maeve sat. She didn't sip the brandy. She drank it exactly as she had the willow bark tincture, letting the alcohol burn away the lingering cold in her chest. Alistair stood by the mantel, looking down at the flames. He took a slow sip of his drink. The silence stretched, but it was no longer aggressive. It was heavy, calculating, and thick with unspoken questions. "You did not learn commercial banking law managing a bankrupt country estate," Alistair finally said, not looking at her. "My father was a magistrate before he inherited the estate," Maeve answered, her voice quiet. "When he grew ill, he taught me to read his briefs. He said a woman with a sharp mind was a threat, but a woman with a sharp mind and an understanding of the law was a weapon. He was right. Alistair turned to face her. My brother nearly bankrupted Vanguard today through sheer, unadulterated stupidity. My secretary is a sycophant who wouldn't know a forged customs seal if it were branded onto his forehead. He walked toward her, stopping a few feet from the chair. He looked down at her. I am a man who appreciates efficiency, Alistair said, his voice stripped of all its usual cynicism. I have no use for polite conversation, I despise society, and I have a profound hatred for incompetence. You possess an aggressive lack of manners, you lie terribly, and you are shockingly competent. Maeve gripped the crystal glass tightly. Her heart was beating so fast she felt dizzy. What are you saying? I'm offering you a position. As what? A charity case? Maeve spat, her pride flaring up, hot and defensive. I told you, I will not be dependent on anyone. I will not be a ward in your house to assuage your conscience. I don't have a conscience, Maeve, Alistair said softly. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded strange on his lips, heavy, deliberate. And I am not offering charity. I'm offering a contract. He walked to his massive mahogany desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a fresh sheet of thick parchment. He picked up a pen and began to write, his hand moving quickly over the page. You will act as my private financial secretary, Alistair said as he wrote. You will have full access to the Vanguard ledgers, the shipping manifests, and the estate accounts. You will fix the absolute mess my brother has made of the French trade routes. You will reside in this house, in a suite of rooms on the second floor. You will be provided a wardrobe allowance so you can burn that atrocious potato sack. He finished writing, signed his name with a sharp flourish, and blew on the ink to dry it. He walked back and held the paper out to her. Maeve didn't take it. She stared at it. And my salary? Alistair's mouth twitched. It was a genuine, rare ghost of a smile. £300 a year, payable quarterly. It was a staggering sum. It was independence. It was safety. It was everything Constance had told her she would never have. Maeve looked up from the paper. She looked into Alistair's gray eyes. They were hard, intelligent, and entirely unsentimental. He wasn't saving a damsel in distress. He was hiring a mercenary, and she respected him completely for it. She reached out and took the parchment. She read the single, brutal paragraph. It outlined exactly what he had said. It was a cold, legal document. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. I require a desk, Maeve said, her voice finally steady. And I will not take my meals in the servants' hall. I will eat in my rooms. Agreed, Alistair said. And if you ever speak to me the way you spoke to that solicitor, I will walk out the door and leave you to drown in your brother's debts. Alistair let out a short, harsh laugh. It was a sound of pure, gritty amusement. I have no doubt that you would. Do we have an agreement, then? Maeve looked at the fire, letting the heat soak into her bruised, exhausted bones. She looked down at the mud caking her father's oversized boots. She had walked out of her home with nothing but the clothes on her back and the freezing rain on her skin. She had crawled through the mud, and she had survived. She looked back up at the Duke of Penrith. We have an agreement, Your Grace, Maeve said. She didn't smile. Neither did he. But as Alistair turned back to pour himself another glass of brandy, the crushing, suffocating tension that had existed between them since the ditch finally broke, replaced by the quiet, dangerous hum of a deeply forged alliance. They were two entirely pragmatic, cynical survivors who had just realized that they no longer had to survive alone. Maeve didn't find a fairy tale in the freezing mud, and Alistair certainly didn't rescue a princess. Instead, they forged something far sharper, an alliance built on cold ledgers, ruthless pragmatism, and a mutual refusal to surrender. Sometimes the most compelling romances don't start with a breathless kiss. They start with a legally binding contract and a shared glass of brandy in the quiet dark. If you loved watching Maeve carve her own gritty path to survival, hit that like button and share this video. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another slow burn historical drama.